Good afternoon and welcome to the first session of Life Sciences for Winter School. It is 12:45, so we will start. And I know for most of you it is your last session of your day. But today we are going to focus on responding to the environment in humans. So we will continue with this during the course of today and then tomorrow because it is quite a large section. I am Katie Lewis and I'll be your tutor for both of the sessions. So welcome to the sessions. Please ensure you've got your tutor, the notes in front of you with all the questions as we will be working through that. Okay. So before we even look at the content, it is very important that you have a look at the examination guidelines for life sciences. So this document is available online, and I'm sure you can ask your teacher for it as well. But this is a great tool to use in preparation for your exams, for prelims, and for finals. I would treat it as a checklist. So for every topic of the work, it will tell you what you need to know for the exam. So then you would go and then I would tick it off as you study and you go through it and you know what it is. And if there is a section of work that you don't know or you just need something re-explained to you, then just reach out to your teacher or go back to these tutor notes because that would help you with it. But I want you to really try before you walk into prelims and then definitely for finals, make sure you know everything in this document. Right, so today we are looking at human responses to the environment. And this section of work is all in paper one and makes up 54 marks of paper one. So it's almost making up a third of paper one, which is quite a big section in your paper. So we're going to focus on the human nervous system, and you can see here the human nervous system, and then it splits it up into the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, which is broken up further into the autonomic nervous system. And then it looks at your neurons, a reflex arc, and then disorders, and then receptors. So that will be our first part. And then we will go into the eye and the ear and looking at those structures of the eye and the ear, the functions of each structure, and then processes that are involved in both of them, and then as well as any disorders or visual or hearing defects. So that is the examination guidelines. So before we get started, I want you to just wake up your brain a bit for life sciences and just to see what you know. I would like you to do a little pre-quiz so you can scan the QR code. This is also at the back of your learner material, the booklet you have in front of you. So I want you to quickly just have a look at just do this. Take about 5 minutes. When you click on the link, it should take you to a page which looks like this. All multiple choice questions, so it should be nice and easy. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes to quickly just do this pre-test, just so you can see where you are at. And then hopefully by the end of the second session tomorrow, when we do it again, you would get more correct. All right, so I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to do this. I'll give you another 2 more minutes. Yeah, so I hope you've completed the pre-quiz. Like I said, this is just to see where you're at. And at the end of the second session, then we'll do it again to see that you've learned something. All right, so we're going to go to our booklets and we are going to start off with our multiple choice questions. So again, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to complete the multiple choice questions, and then we're going to go through it step by step. And I'm going to show you how do you approach multiple choice questions, how do you take it apart to get to the correct answer, and then we'll move on to the rest. I will do some explaining of certain topics as we go along. But again, I'm going to give you 5 more minutes to complete the multiple choice questions. I'll give you a few more minutes, about 2 more minutes, and then we'll go through it. Okay, so before we go through it, you should be quite familiar with the layout of a life sciences exam. Always starts with your multiple choice questions, which are 2 marks each. Then it goes to your terminology, your A, B, both 9 short answers, and then it goes more to your longer answers. So the booklet that you have in front of you is following the type of format that you would find in your exams. So when it comes to multiple choice, what I want to bring to your attention is you only write down one letter. So you cannot write down A slash D and and the answer A might be correct, but because you wrote down 2 options, you're going to lose the marks completely. So it's very, very important that when you answer multiple choice questions, you only write down one answer. All right, so let's start marking. So if we look at 1.1.1, it says which part of the neuron transmits impulses towards the cell body. So those are the key words I would highlight there. What part is taking it towards the cell body? Now you look at your options. So we know that dendrites do take impulses towards the cell body. Let's just look at our other options. Myelin sheath. Well, myelin sheath is wrapped around the axon and provides insulation and speeds up impulses. Axon takes impulses away from the cell body. So always remember A for axon, A for away from the cell body. And the question's asking towards. And then synapse, remember synapse is the gap between neurons, which allows the impulse to travel from one neuron to another. So the correct answer for 1.1.1 is A. It would be the dendrite takes the impulses towards the cell body. 1.1.2, which one of the following shows a correct sequence of an impulse from the receptor in a simple reflex arc? So they want the correct sequence from the points of the receptor in a simple reflex arc. So we know that the receptor will detect the stimulus, which is a change in the environment, and they generate an impulse. Now that needs to go towards the central nervous system. So if we look at our options, we have sensory neuron, motor neuron, sensory neuron effector. So which one is taking it towards the central nervous system would be the sensory neuron. So we're automatically looking at option A and C, and we can eliminate B and D. And then we look through the rest. So from the sensory neuron, then it goes through the dorsal root into the spinal cord, then motor neuron through the ventral root to effector. This option seems correct, but I always want to check myself. How do I know? Well, sensory neuron takes it towards the central nervous system, and the motor neuron takes it away, and it goes through the dorsal root of the spinal cord, then through the ventral root. And I always know D before V, so that's how I remember that. And then it goes to the effector. If I look at option C is saying the sensory neuron through the dorsal root to the effector and then to the motor neuron, which isn't correct. That's not the correct order. The effector is a muscle gland that's going to bring about a response. So the correct answer for 1.1.2 would be A. 1.1.3, a list of the functions of the brain is provided below. Interprets sensations, regulates involuntary actions, controls higher thought processes, controls voluntary actions. So which one of the following combinations are the functions of the cerebrum? So here it's important that you know the functions of the different parts of the brain. They want the cerebrum. So now we go to our list. Does the cerebrum interpret sensations? Yes, it does. Does it regulate involuntary actions? No. What part of the brain regulates involuntary actions, such as breathing and your heart rate? That would be your medulla oblongata. Okay, next one, controls higher thought processes. Does your cerebrum do that? Yes, remember it's involved in intelligence. And does it control voluntary actions? Yes, it does. So first I make my checklist at the options, and now I'll go find the correct combination that has 1, 3, and 4, and that option will be C. Then 1.1.4, the myelin sheath on a nerve cell, and I spoke about this in the previous multiple choice questions. Does it provide electrical insulation? Yes, it does. Does it transport impulses towards the cell body? No. Does it receive impulses from the axon? No. Does it convert stimuli into impulses? No. So the myelin sheath, they want to know about that, and it provides electrical insulation. So your answer is A. Then questions 1.1.5 and 1.1.6 are based on the diagram of the brain below. So straight away, you should know all the structures of the brain. So we can quickly go through it. One will be the structure over here, which connects the left to the right hemisphere, and that would be the corpus callosum. 2 is making up the bulk of it, which is the cerebrum. 3 is sitting underneath that, so it would be the cerebellum, and 4 would be your medulla oblongata. So the question says, which one of the following represents the corpus callosum? So you see, because I've already identified it, it makes answering these questions easier. And that would be 1. And the corpus callosum is connecting the left and the right hemisphere. So there's communication between the two hemispheres. Then 1.1.6, which one of the following is the function of part 3? So part 3 we've identified as the cerebellum. So now we need to look. Does the cerebellum control voluntary movements? No, the cerebrum does that. Does it control involuntary movements? No, the medulla oblongata does that. Does it coordinate voluntary movements? Yes, it does. And does it control all sensations? No, that would be the cerebrum. So the answer for 1.1.6 is C. It's important to not get confused between the two functions of the cerebrum and the cerebellum when it comes to voluntary movements. The cerebrum controls voluntary movement. So that's you picking up a pen now. But the cerebellum is coordinating voluntary movements together. So I always say a soccer player that is running in a match, he's looking where the opponents are, he's looking where the goalie is, he's using his arms to run, the leg to kick the ball. So that would be coordinating movements together, which is the cerebellum. All right. If we go to 1.1.7, the diagram below represents a part of the human eye. So again, I start off by just orientating myself with the diagram and what the different structures are. So we have Z, which will be the lens. We have Y, which would be the suspensory ligaments. And we have X, which would be your ciliary muscle, which is in your ciliary body. Okay, so that's just the structures of them. Then I go to the question. So it says a spectator in a soccer stadium is seated 200 meters away. So that's far from the field. Which one of the following describes a condition of structures X, Y, and Z when he looks at the ball placed in the middle of the field? So because it is far away, it's further than 6 meters, we know that my end result is going to be that my lens must become less convex. So then I start looking at my options, and option B and option C have it when my lens becomes less convex. That's the end goal of it. So less refraction of light takes place. Now, how do I let it become less convex? Well, here, my ciliary muscles become relaxed and my suspensory ligaments become taut, which means that they tighten. So I always picture that my lens, the suspensory ligaments, as it tightens, it pulls it upwards and pulls it downwards. And that's how it becomes less convex. And then your ciliary muscle, in order for the suspensory ligaments to change, your ciliary muscle had to relax. So the answer for this one is C. So the goal was to get it less convex. How did I let that happen? Well, my ciliary muscle relaxed and my suspensory ligaments became taut. 1.1.8, it says, which one of the following combinations is correct for visual defect of the eye? So we want to look at the defects of the eye. Lately in exam papers, they are asking more and more questions on visual defects and hearing defects. There are only 4 that you have to learn. So it is important that you don't bypass it, that you do spend time understanding what those visual defects are, but also knowing how to treat it and how to correct it. Okay, so let's look at the possible answers here. So the first one is astigmatism. So astigmatism, it is shaped by an irregular cornea or lens, so that would be correct, and that you can treat it with corrective lenses. That is right. And then we look at long-sightedness. So long-sightedness means you can see far, but you can't see close. And they say eyeball is longer than normal. And that's not correct. That longer should be shorter than normal. So then I know this one's wrong and that can't be an answer. Then we look at the next one, cataracts. So cataracts is when your eye, especially your cornea, becomes very cloudy. So nothing can really, not light can enter properly. So it's got nothing to do with the lens becoming inelastic. So that's not correct. And then short-sightedness, this is when the eyeball is shorter than normal. And short-sightedness means I can see near, but I can't see far. And that's incorrect. So the shorter should change to longer. So once I've worked through my options, you can see the only correct answer would be A for 1.1.8. Okay, going on to 1.1.9. So the diagram below shows a part of the human ear. So this we can see is representing the middle part of the human ear. And again, if I label it just so I can get orientation of what I'm looking at, A would be your tympanic membrane, then it goes to your ossicles, and then you've got your 2 windows, and you've got your oval window and your round window. And again, O comes before R. And you can see with the shape sometimes that does help you to figure out which one's which, but they don't always draw it to scale. And then C would be the eustachian tube. So the question says, which one of the following occurs when there are excess waves in the inner ear? So we don't want the excess waves to go back into the cochlea because that will distort the sound. So we want to absorb those pressure waves. We don't want it to go out again because that will cause an echo. So which one is going to absorb it? And your answer is going to be B. It would be your round window, which would absorb any excess waves. So your answer for this one would be C. Your tympanic membrane would create the vibrations going across in the ossicles, and your eustachian tube equalizes the pressure. So your answer for that one was C. And the last multiple choice question, 1.1.10, the diagrams below represent the transmission of impulses from a structure in the inner ear to the brain. So you've got that diagram, and then it says the nerve impulses for balance, so that's key, are transmitted as follows. So what is the order for it? So you've got part of your inner ear over here. Now, because it has to do with balance, balance is going to take place, impulse will be created in your vestibular apparatus. So it's going to be in this section over here, which is E. J is a cochlea, which is going to have to do with hearing. Right, so we've got E, Then they all go along the auditory nerve, which would be F. And then because it has to do with balance, what part of the brain is it going to? Is it going to the cerebrum or is it going to the cerebellum? And as it's balanced, it's going to the cerebellum, so it's going to H. So your order for this one would be E, F, H, and your answer is B. And remember, multiple choice is 2 marks or nothing. So work through it. It's sometimes the trickier questions come out of multiple choice. So you really have to read the question carefully and read all the options before you write down an answer. All right, so that's our multiple choice questions done. We're now going to move on to biological terms. So I'm going to give you about 6 minutes to answer these biological term questions. I'll give you about 2 more minutes and then we'll go through it. right, let's start to go through a biological term. So I know sometimes this is a tricky part of the paper because you have to know it, but I really suggest that when it comes to your entire exam, including the section, that you do not leave anything out. Rather try put some answer down than nothing at all. And then just a side note to remember, when it comes to biological terms, you need to write out the name in full. So you cannot write down the abbreviation. That won't be accepted. You have to write it out in full. All right, let's start to go through it. So 1.2.1, the part of the brain that regulates breathing. So what part of the brain is regulating breathing? In other words, is controlling involuntary actions, and that would be the medulla oblongata. So I will put up the answers now if you just need some spelling, just once I've gone through it. So 1.2.1 is medulla oblongata. 1.2.2, the part of the brain that connects the left and the right hemispheres. So that would be corpus callosum. Be careful to not write corpus luteum. Corpus luteum comes with the reproductive system part, but it is not the brain. So that's corpus callosum. Just going to put the answers up so you can just see spelling while we go. 1.2.3, the branch of the autonomic nervous system that restores an increased heart rate back to normal. So remember, the autonomic nervous system is split into the sympathetic and parasympathetic. And sympathetic will happen in your fight or flight mode. So there will be lots of reactions in your body that are happening under the influence of adrenaline. But the parasympathetic brings it back down to normal because you can't have your body in that sustained state all the time. And I also think parasympathetic, think slow down. So that's why the answer for 1.2.3 is your parasympathetic nervous system. 1.2.4, the part of the nervous system that consists of sympathetic and parasympathetic sections. So that is actually in your answer before, but it'll be your autonomic nervous system. And that is going to control involuntary actions. But I will touch on this a bit later when we go into more detail. 1.2.5, a functional gap between two consecutive neurons. So a gap between two neurons, and that would be a synapse. Remember, that is how the impulse jumps from one neuron to another. 1.2.6, the disease characterized by the degeneration of brain tissue leading to memory loss. So there are two diseases you need to know for the nervous system section, which is Alzheimer's and multiple sclerosis. Alzheimer's results in memory loss. Multiple sclerosis is going to result in your myelin sheath. Well, it's due to your myelin sheath that is being broken down and no longer there. So therefore, your movements may be slower. But this one wants to do memory loss, so it's Alzheimer's. 1.2.7, receptors. Remember, receptors detect changes in the environment in the ear that detect changes in speed and direction of movement of the head. So this we'll touch on tomorrow, but there are two receptors that are going to deal with balance, and that would be your cristae and your macula. And then for this scenario, because it's a speed and direction, it's going to be your cristae. 1.2.8, the ossicle that transfers vibration to the oval window. So the ossicle that has taken it to the oval window. So your smallest one, which is your stapes or your stirrup, whichever one, that will mark both of them correct. 1.2.9, photoreceptors that react to low light intensity and are responsible for black and white vision. So you would know that there are two photoreceptors in our eye, two types. We have our rods and our cones. Our rods allow us to see in black and white, and our cones allows us to see in color. And the way I remember it is C, cone, C for color. But this question wants for black and white vision, so that would be your rods. And then 1.2.10, the pigmented layer of the eye. So of the eye that is absorbing excess light, and it's a pigmented one, and that would be the choroid. It is important again that you don't get confused by choroid, which is in the reproductive part of paper one, and choroid ended in the D, which is that layer of that eye absorbing excess light, but also supplying the eye with nutrients. Okay, so that is your biological terms. Let's move on to matching columns. So I'm going to give you again 4 minutes to quickly do this. Before you start this, I just want you to read the instructions carefully because we often find students make mistakes because they didn't read the instructions. So for this one, you need to indicate whether each of the descriptions in column 1 apply to A only, B only, both A and B, or none of the items in column 2. And you have to write A only, B only, both A and B, or none next to the question numbers. So just make sure you answer this question correctly. All right, I'll give you about 4 minutes to do this one. Okay, let's go through this question. So 1.3.1, the functional connection between two consecutive neurons. So we've done this, was very similar to the terminology question, but that would be synapse. So your answer is B only. Remember, the receptor is going to detect the stimulus and generate an impulse, but the synapse is going to be between two consecutive neurons, which is two neurons next to each other. 1.3.2, a disorder caused by the degeneration of the myelin sheath of motor neurons. So this is when your myelin sheath is breaking down, and that will be multiple sclerosis, which is A only. And a way to remember MS, and your myelin sheath has MS there. So that's how I remember which disorder is caused by what. So Alzheimer's, that'll be where your brain tissue, your neurons could break down, and that leads to memory loss, but multiple sclerosis is when your myelin sheath breaks down. 1.3.3, a component of the peripheral nervous system. And they love to ask this question because they see it almost like a trick question. So remember, the peripheral nervous system is outside of the central nervous system, but it consists of cranial nerves and spinal nerves. So your answer for this one is both A and B. So your peripheral nervous system is consistent of those, where your central nervous system consists of your brain and your spinal cord. Then 1.3.4, the part of the brain that connects the left and the right hemispheres. Again, this has become quite repetitive. And here they again want to trick you out because you have corpus luteum and corpus callosum. But the part that's connecting the left and the right, maybe you can remember it at the C. So that will be your second C, which is your callosum. So the answer is B only. Your corpus luteum is in the menstrual cycle part. 1.3.5, the area on the retina where there are no rods or cones. Now remember, your rods and cones are photoreceptors, and it needs to be on your retina, which is your back of your eye. Your blind spot has no rods and cones. So if light does ever fall in there, you can't see anything. And the cornea is not on the retina, that is on the front of your eye. It doesn't have photoreceptors, but they're asked on the retina. So your answer for this one is A only. And then 1.3.6, a device that is responsible for the drainage of fluid from the middle ear. And that would be a grommet, A only. Remember, grommet is a little tube that gets inserted into your tympanic membrane that will allow any fluid to drain out to help equalize the pressure. A hearing aid will enable you to hear. All right, so that is your matching columns question. Right, so before we go into other questions, I just want to do a quick recap for you on certain things that I think are quite important, and then we will go on to the rest. So with the nervous system, like I said to you, the nervous system is split into two sections. You have the central nervous system, which the brain and the spinal cord makes up, and you have the peripheral nervous system, which we can break down into more segments, which I'll touch on just now, but it will consist of your spinal and cranial nerves. Now, please, you cannot write CNS for central nervous system and PNS for peripheral nervous system. They won't accept that. So you have to write it out in full. So if we look at the central nervous system and we look at the brain, this picture is the best picture to study for the structure of the brain. You find it in the Mind the Gap textbook, which is available online. So if we look at the brain and the structure and the different functions of those structures, it is so important that you know this. You will most likely get a picture and they'll ask you to label and they'll ask you what the certain functions, where they are in the picture. So if we look at the brain structure, you have the cerebrum, which is making up the bulk of the brain. And remember, it controls voluntary actions. It receives and interprets sensations from sense organs. So sometimes they might want to ask you, where is sound interpreted? Now remember, sound forms part of your sense organs, comes from your ears. So that's why it'll be the cerebrum. And then it's also involved in higher thought processes, which is your intelligence as well as memory. So that's your cerebrum. Then in the cerebrum, dividing the left and the right side, which is actually doing the job of connecting the left and the right hemisphere so communication between the two can happen, is the corpus callosum, which we've dealt with quite a bit so far in the questions. Then we have this little structure underneath the bulk of the brain, which is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum coordinates voluntary movement. So like I said to you before, do not get confused between the cerebrum, which controls voluntary actions, and the cerebellum, which coordinates voluntary movements. It's like, for example, a person playing a piano. They need to read the notes, they need to move their hands, their fingers to play, they're moving their foot to go on the pedals, same as a ballet dancer. So that'll be coordinating many movements together. And the cerebellum is also helping with balance. And we know that the vestibular apparatus in the ear is going to help with balance and send that impulse to the cerebellum, which will help interpret it. Then we move on to the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland you may have touched on before, that is secreting many hormones, FSH, LH, etc., and you'll learn a few more. We have the medulla oblongata underneath. And the medulla oblongata's job is to take impulses from the spinal cord to the brain, and then the brain will interpret it and decide on the appropriate action, and they will take that impulse back down to the spinal cord to where it needs to go. But the medulla oblongata also controls involuntary actions, such as your heartbeat and breathing. And then we've got the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is a control center for hunger, thirst, body temperature, and emotions. All right, so that's the structure of the brain. Like I said, please know how to label it and what the different functions are. Before I go on, you should also know how the brain is protected. So we know that it is being protected by the cranium. You cannot say the skull. The skull is the whole structure by the face, but the cranium will house the brain. And then it's surrounded by a membrane called meninges. And then it also has cerebrospinal fluid. So you need to know how it is protected. Then if we look at the spinal cord, so the spinal cord structure is quite important. So we obviously know that our neurons are going to our spinal cord and it's taken, the impulse from the neurons to the spinal cord, and then the impulse will leave the spinal cord and go along other neurons. So the neuron which has taken it to the spinal cord, to the central nervous system, would be your sensory neurons. And your sensory neurons always travel through the dorsal root, which is the top part of the spinal cord. The impulse then goes to your connector or interneuron, and then the impulse would leave the spinal cord through motor neurons, so it's leaving, and will exit through the ventral root. So like I said to you when we were doing the multiple choice, the order would be for the spinal cord, will go through the dorsal root and out through the ventral root. And the way I remember it is D before V. How's your spinal cord protected? Well, it's in vertebrae, so that's the bony structure, as well as it's got your meninges and your spinal fluid, your cerebrospinal fluid surrounding it. Okay, so if we look at a breakdown of the nervous system, so we can divide the nervous system into the central nervous system, which we discussed already, consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is made up of your spinal and cranial nerves. However, your peripheral nervous system can be further split up into your somatic and to your autonomic nervous system. Now, your somatic nervous system is controlling your voluntary muscles, or it's going to your voluntary muscles, Well, your autonomic, I just think of automatic, it does it without us thinking it. That will then control your involuntary actions, which we then split up into our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. Now, remember, I said the sympathetic nervous system will be activated during our fight or flight mode, and that will be activated or stimulated under the influence of adrenaline. So, adrenaline is going to kickstart the whole process. And just think in an emergency situation, what happens to your body? Well, your heart beats faster. Why would your heart beat faster? Because you want to pump more oxygen around the body. Why do you want more oxygen pumped around the body? So your body can use it to undergo cellular respiration faster, which means you have more energy. So you can react more, you can run faster, etc. Your pupils dilate. Why? To gather more light in. Your liver and muscles convert excess glycogen, which is your stored glucose, into glucose. Again, so you have glucose with the oxygen to undergo cellular respiration so you can create more energy. So this is happening in an emergency situation. But like I said, we don't want our body to stay in that state forever. It's not healthy. So in order to bring it back down to normal, the parasympathetic nervous system will get stimulated. And like I said, that's returning everything back to normal, returns your heart rate back to normal. Your pupils will constrict. Your blood flow would be slower around your body. All right, so for the nervous system, we got to basically get the impulses to our central nervous system. The central nervous system always says, interprets it and decides on the appropriate action and then goes along and then will go along your peripheral nervous system, your neurons, to effectors, which are muscles and glands, to bring about an appropriate response. All right, so that's just a quick summary of the nervous system. And I quite like the different drawings and flow diagrams that you get of it. But just key, the peripheral nervous system is split up into the somatic and to the autonomic. Somatic is your voluntary movements. Your autonomic is your involuntary movements. And then we can further split up your autonomic into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic, under the influence of adrenaline, fight or flight mode, emergency situation. Parasympathetic, like I said, I think slows down, stops, so that's returning your body back to normal. And then this is just a diagram showing changes that will happen in your body under sympathetic and parasympathetic. The ones which are important to know would be in a fight or flight situation, emergency situation. We know our pupils dilate, and why? To allow more light to enter the eye. Our heart would accelerate, so increase our heart rate. And that happens. Why? So we can get oxygen pumped around the body faster, like I said, to undergo cellular respiration. And to get more oxygen in, our lungs and our airways would dilate. And then the other one would be your liver. We want more glucose in our body, so glycogen is converted to glucose. So those would be the main ones. And the parasympathetic is doing the opposite. Remember, it's bringing everything back down to normal. All right, so let's carry on with our booklet. Let's go to page 9 and start with question 1.4. So this is for 8 marks. So I'm going to give you about 6 to 8 minutes to do this, and then we will discuss it and go through the answers. I'll give you another minute or so, and then we will discuss it. Okay, let's discuss this question. So 1.4 says the flow diagram below represents the components of the nervous system. So you can see here we have the nervous system, which has been split up into two. We have the central nervous system. So what would the other one be? That would be the peripheral nervous system. Then if we work with the central nervous system, we can see the central nervous system is split up into the brain. And what is the other component of the central nervous system? That would be the spinal cord. Okay, then that's the central nervous system done. Let's move to the other side. So A was the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is split up or consists of cranial nerves, and the other one is spinal nerves. Then if we look at that, then we have D. And you can see D is being split up into the sympathetic nervous system and something else. So therefore, D must be the autonomic nervous system. And E would be the parasympathetic nervous system. So before I even start looking at the questions, I've just looked at the flow diagram and quickly filled in what I knew to help me answer the questions. Okay, now I start to look at the questions. So 1.4.1 says identify the components of the nervous system represented by A. So we said A, it will be the peripheral nervous system. And then D, so remember D is split up into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, so that has to be the autonomic nervous system. It won't be the somatic. Then 1.4.2 says name the type of nerves found at C, and that we filled in, it would be your spinal nerves. Why? Because your peripheral nervous system consists of your cranial and your spinal nerves. Do you see how easy it becomes answering questions if I just go and fill in the diagram quickly, just so I can orientate myself? Okay, 1.4.3 says give the letter and name of the component that slows down the heart rate when an emergency has passed. So that's returning the heart rate back to normal. And they want the letter and name. And look, it's for 2 marks. So it's so important you read the questions carefully. So what is the letter name that slows the heart rate down to normal after emergency has passed? And that would be the letter is E, and the name would be your parasympathetic nervous system. 1 mark for E, 1 mark for parasympathetic nervous system. I'm just going to pop the answers here so you can also see. Then 1.4.4 says name the nerve cells that make up nervous tissue. So this might seem like a tricky question, but it's a straightforward one. What are the nerve cells called? And remember, we were working with it in previous questions. Your motor neurons, sensory neurons, connector neurons, they are called neurons. And then 1.4.5 state 2 ways in which the brain is protected. So they want 2 things, and it's for 2 marks. So the obvious one that you might go for is the cranium. Remember, don't say skull. And then your other ones would be your meninges, which is that membrane surrounding it, or you could have said cerebrospinal fluid. You can say any 2. but they're only going to mark the first two. So be confident in your answers. All right, so that would be the answers for question 1.4. Let's go on to question 1.5. So this question is 16 marks. So remember in life science, they typically allocate a minute a mark. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you about 10 minutes, 10 to 12 minutes to answer this one, and then we will discuss it.
Good day, Kaylee. I know you're giving them time to answer the question. President I just wants you, in the chat they mentioned, can you go back, please? I don't know what they're referring to.
Sorry, Michelle, you broke up a bit.
I see in the chat, President High School has indicated, can you go back, please? So if
Oh,
you
sure.
can maybe just ask what the question is, then I will see if they can give it in the chat, or maybe the teacher or someone can just type in the chat what the problem is.
Sure. I'm going to go back. If there are any questions or you want me to explain something or you'd like to see answered, just type it in the chat and then Michelle would let me know. I'm going to give you a few more minutes to answer question 1.5 and then we will go through it. Okay, let's have a look at question 1.5. So, firstly, it says the diagram below represents parts of the central nervous system. So again, before I even look at the questions, I like to orientate myself with the diagram. Remember, everything they give you in a question has information in it. Whether it's a text or it's a diagram, you have to make sure you interpret that before you look at the questions. Right, so what am I seeing here? So straight away, I will start to label the brain, the diagram. So what I see, so A would be the bulk of the brain, which would be the cerebrum. And again, you must think straight away, okay, what does the cerebrum do? So controls voluntary actions, receives and interprets sensations from sense organs, and involved in higher thought process. So those are things you must think of when you're looking at the question. B would be the corpus callosum, which is connecting the left and the right hemisphere. C is going to be your medulla oblongata, and that we know controls involuntary actions. D is going to be the cerebellum, which we know is involved in coordinating voluntary actions and with balance, and E is going to be a spinal cord. So this picture is a flipped one of the one we saw earlier. So if I just quickly look at this brain structure, you can see the cerebellum's on the right, while on this one, the cerebellum's on the left. But don't get confused, it's not too difficult to label. So I start off by just quickly labeling the different parts. Now we look at the question. So 1.5.1 says name the two components of the central nervous system shown in the diagram. So they want two parts of the central nervous system that you can see over here, and it's for 2 marks. Now you know what two things make up the central nervous system. That would be the brain, and we can see the brain here, and it will be the spinal cord, and you can see the spinal cord here. So the answer for 1.5.1 is going to be brain, 1 mark, and spinal cord, your second mark. Then 1.5.2, identify parts B. Now, because I already labeled it before I interpreted the questions, it helps me to answer those questions. So they want you to identify part B. Part B is sitting over there in your cerebrum, and it's connecting your left and your right hemispheres. So your answer for B will be corpus callosum. Then they want you to identify part D. So part D is that little structure underneath the bulk of the brain. You almost picture the brain like a mushroom. So you've got the cap of it, and then you have the stalk, and then you've got the little cerebellum underneath it. So part D would be the cerebellum. Then the question 1.45.3 says, give the letter and name of the part that controls. Letter and name. And you can see each of these is going to be worth 2 marks. So the letter name of the part that controls the heartbeat. You know the heartbeat is an involuntary action. And what part of the brain controls involuntary actions? That's going to be the medulla oblongata. But they want the letter and name. So for this one, your answer is C, and that's going to get you 1 mark. And the name, medulla oblongata, 2nd mark. The next one says, give the letter name of the part that controls voluntary action. So it's controlling voluntary action. So we know the cerebrum controls voluntary actions, but they want the letter and name. So it's going to be A, cerebrum. So that 1 mark for the A, 1 mark for cerebrum. And the last one of this question, give the letter name of the part that controls is responsible for motor coordination. So motor would be movement and coordinating. So what is coordinating your motor movements? And that is going to be your cerebellum because it's the coordination part. So it would be D, one mark, cerebellum, another mark. So I'm just going to pop the answers there so you can see it. So we were on 1.5.3. Look how the ticks are allocated. Because they asked for the letter and name, you have to give it. So 1 mark for the letter. We were on the last one. So D, and another mark for cerebellum. Okay, and these can be easy questions, but sometimes in a stressful situation like the exam, you forget, you only write the letter or you only write the name, and you would know, and you most likely know both. So just make sure you read in very, very carefully the questions. Okay, 1.5.4 state one way in which the brain is protected. They only want one thing now. And then for this one, you have 3 options that you can go for. So you can go for cranium. Remember, stick to cranium, not skull. You can go for meninges, which is the membrane surrounding it. And you could go for cerebrospinal fluid. But the obvious one, I just think it's going to be cranium. And meninges will be both for your brain and your spinal cord, but you only need one for this one. Then we move on to 1.5.5, and it's an explain question. So here it says, explain why a person may die if part C is damaged. So firstly, you need to identify what part C is. So part C, we said, was a medulla oblongata. What does the medulla oblongata do? It controls involuntary actions, such as your heartbeat and breathing. Now, if this structure is damaged, why will a person die? That's what the question is asking. And it's explain. So remember, explain is cause and effect. So often say what will happen and why. That's how you got to approach it. So how you answer it, let's look at the memo answer. It controls vital processes, or you can say it controls breathing and heartbeat. And obviously, if that is damaged, your medulla oblongata, you won't be able to control breathing. You won't be able to control your heartbeat. Therefore, if you can't breathe and your heart can't beat, you would then die. So this is how you have to answer it. So it controls vital processes or it controls heartbeat and breathing. And because it's damaged, they will stop. So you will not be able to breathe and your heart won't be able to pump blood around the body. So firstly, you say what it does. So it controls heartbeat and breathing. And because it's damaged, those processes will be stopped. And ultimately, that would lead to a person dying. Okay, so that's how you have to answer it. Careful. Think what medulla oblongata does, and then think if it's damaged, what won't happen then, and how it may result in a person dying. So that's for 2 marks. Then 1.5.6, part E is damaged in a person's lower back. So part E we identified as the spinal cord. Now they say in part E, which the spinal cord, remember, runs all the way down the center of your body. Let's say it's damaged at the lower back. So I'm just doing a line over here. Obviously, it's much lower in the body. So now they're saying that's damaged. Start off by identifying part E. So when I labeled the brain, then we can know what the different structures are, and we know that E would be the spinal cord. So there's the answer. But the next question says, explain, another explain question. And they're usually worth 2 to 3 marks. So explain why the person will have no control of the skeletal muscles of the legs. So why will the person have no control of the skeletal muscles of the legs? Now you need to almost go back to your grade 10 knowledge. Your skeletal muscles are going to be voluntary controlled. So you have it's voluntary actions that will bring about. And that would be controlled by your cerebrum. Okay, so remember your cerebrum controls voluntary actions. So now it says, explain why the person will have no control of the muscles of their legs if the spinal cord is damaged at the lower back. So basically, what will happen is the brain would be saying, okay, we need to move your leg so that it's been here, the message has been said in the cerebrum, and it will go to this down the spinal cord, but it will stop at where the spinal cord is damaged. And it can't go further that point, and it can't go to your skeletal muscles because it's stopped, it's damaged over there. So that's what is happening with this. But now you got to explain it. And like I said, anything to do with the brain, you got to be as specific as possible in naming the structure that it's involved. And like I said, because this is skeletal muscles, which is under voluntary actions, that would be the cerebrum. So let's look at how to answer it for the 2 marks. So you're going to get 1 mark for saying impulses from the cerebrum. You see, they've specified what part of the brain will not be transmitted to the skeletal muscles. So in other words, your brain and the cerebrum is interpreting it, and the impulse goes down, but it will stop at the point where it's damaged, and it cannot reach the skeletal muscles. So your answer, again, explain. So cause and effect. So the impulses from the cerebrum, 1 mark, are not transmitted to the skeletal muscles, 2nd mark, because they want to know why the person has no control of the muscles in the legs. And remember, impulses will be controlling it. And if the impulse can't get there, no control can happen of those muscles. Why is the impulse not getting there? Because the spinal cord is damaged at the lower back of the person. All right. So again, just remember when you come to explain questions, it's cause and effect. And you have to break apart that question and make sure you're answering that question fully. Okay, I'm just going to leave this on for 30 seconds, just if you want to jot down anything if you didn't catch it, and then we'll move on to the next section of the work. Okay, we're going to go on. So the next part we're going to go into a bit more detail about neurons, and then we're going to look at reflex arc because they tend to like asking questions about reflex arc and reflex action, and you need to know the neurons in order to answer those questions. All right. So let's have a quick recap before we look at those questions. So firstly, the whole section of responding to the environment in humans is that there needs to be a change in the environment. And the change in the environment is called a stimulus. So stimulus is a change in the environment. I say, for example, I'm driving in my car and I see that the robot is changing from green to orange to red. So the change in the environment, I'm seeing the change in the traffic lights. It could be the change in the lights. It could be the change in the temperature. So the whole point of this is how our body responds to changes, and ultimately it's a way of protecting our body from any harm and almost normalizing and stabilizing it. So there are receptors all over our body, in our skin, eyes, ears, etc. And they would detect that change. They detect the stimulus. And they would then generate an impulse. And that impulse gets sent around our body, sent along neurons, and then will go to the brain and the spinal cord, which will decide on the appropriate action. And from there, it will go back along the neurons to the effectors. And remember, the effectors are muscles or glands that would bring about the appropriate response. So our neurons are basically our structural and functional units of the nervous system because it's what makes up the nervous system and it's what's carrying the impulses around our body. Okay, so let's quickly recap the three types of neurons we have. So firstly, we have the sensory neuron. So the sensory neuron is going to take the impulse towards the central nervous system. So it's taking it, I almost remember sensory, it's taking it from our sense organs towards the central nervous system. And if we look at the structure of a sensory neuron, we have the cell body over here, we have our dendrites up here, and we have the axon over here. And you would know that the impulse goes from dendrites to the axon. So it's going in that direction. It is important that you know the structure of a sensory neuron because they often ask you to identify it. So in this case, we have the cell body over there with a little extension of it, one extension, and that would then break up into the dendrites and then to the axon. So the sensory neuron, also called the afferent neuron with the A, transmits impulses towards the central nervous system. Then if we move on, we have the motor neuron, which I always say looks like a typical type of neuron when we think of neurons. So our motor neuron is going to transmit impulses away from the central nervous system, and it's going to your effectors, to your muscles and your glands. Also can be called the efferent neuron with the E. So it's taking impulses away. And again, it follows the same order from dendrites to the axon. In this case, these are all going to be dendrites. There are multiple dendrites, multiple outgrowths. This would be your cell body, and this would be your axon. So your impulses will go from your dendrites to your axon. So this is your motor neuron. And then we have our interneuron. You may also call it your connector neuron. So here we have the cell body in the middle, and we have two outgrowths from it. This would be your dendrites, and over here, or your dendrites where they gather it, and it goes along here, and here we would have our axon. So again, it's the impulse will travel from the dendrites to the axon. This part over here, sorry, would also be the axon. So with your interneuron, it's a nice way, it's an easy name to remember what it does. It's inter because it's between your sensory and your motor neuron, and this will be found in your central nervous system. So basically, the impulse will go from your sensory neuron to your interneuron and then to your motor neuron and end with an effector. And remember, your neurons don't touch. There's a gap between them, and that gap is called the synapse. So when they ask you identify the type of neuron, you have to identify sensory, motor, or inter or connector neuron. You may be asked to draw a neuron as well. So make sure you know how to draw it and label it. So if we just look at a quick structure of a neuron, so this would be what type of neuron? This would be a motor neuron. So we've got our dendrites over here, which would receive the impulse and take it towards the cell body. We've got our cell body over here with the nucleus. So the impulse goes in, and then the axon is going to take it away from the cell body. And remember I said back in the beginning of the session, axon A for away from the cell body. And then you have a myelin sheath surrounding the axon, and that myelin sheath allows for fast transmission of impulses and provides insulation. And remember, what disease is it when the myelin sheath is damaged? That would be multiple sclerosis. So if we quickly look at a reflex arc. Again, this picture is taken from Mind the Gap, and also it's a good summary of the reflex arc. I really encourage you to just find this on the internet if you don't have it already, and just to learn this. So two definitions you do need to know is reflex action and reflex arc. So I think you've heard reflex action before because it's your blinking, your sneezing, etc. And that's a quick automatic action. You don't think about it and involves the spinal cord. It does not involve the brain. Why? Because you want a quick action to protect your body from harm. If it has to go from spinal cord all the way to your brain and back down again, it's longer, and that may cause your body to be harmed. So reflex action only involves the spinal cord. And what is a reflex arc? Well, reflex arc is the pathway on which the impulse goes to bring about a response to a stimulus during a reflex action. So reflex action, almost think of it, it's like the movement, and it's brought about by a reflex arc, which is the pathway. And I'm going to quickly go through this pathway. So we start off with a stimulus. And remember, stimulus is a change in the environment. In this case, you've got heat from this flame. Your receptors, and the receptors are going to be in the finger over here, is going to detect that stimulus and convert it into an impulse. So your receptors detect the stimulus and convert it and generate an impulse. From there, the impulse travels along sensory neurons to the spinal cord. And through what? Root of the spinal cord is the sensory neuron taking the impulse along. Remember, it's going to be the dorsal roots. So dorsal roots, and your bottom one is going to be ventral roots. So your impulse is generated from the receptor. It's going to travel along the sensory neuron to the spinal cord through the dorsal roots. Then it needs to go to the interneuron. And remember, there's a gap between the neurons. That's a synapse, and that transmits the impulse to the interneuron or connector neuron, which is sitting in the spinal cord. And from there, it's going to then be transmitted the impulse to the motor neuron, again through the synapse. And the motor neuron leaves through the ventral root and would take it to the appropriate effector. And in this case, the effector is going to be the muscles in the finger to contract it so you can pull your finger away. So when you get questions where you have to describe the reflex arc and they're given you a scenario, it is so important that you use that scenario. So what I mean is, in this case, you've got the heat from the flame. So you have to make it specific to that scenario. So the stimulus, the change in the environment is the heat from the flame, which the receptors in the finger would then feel, and they would generate an impulse. Then you would talk about the normal pathway, and then you must be specific with the effector. But this case, the effector is going to be your muscles in your finger. It's the same if you stepped on a thorn. So the pain of stepping on a thorn, the pain receptors would be stimulated. It would generate an impulse, go along the sensory neuron to the interneuron in the spinal cord, to the motor neuron, which would then go to the effectors, which would be the muscles in the foot, so you could lift up your foot from the thorn. So just remember that given your scenario, to please be specific and apply that scenario to your questions. Then what they also like to ask is describe or explain what would happen if this neuron over here is damaged. Well, if this is a sensory neuron, the impulse cannot get past this point. So the person will not be able to feel the heat, won't be able to know what's actually happening because nothing will get past this point. Can still move, but if they don't know it's hot, then it can cause them harm. Or they could say, what happens if there is damage to this neuron, which is a motor neuron? That means the person can feel the stimulus, knows what to do, but the impulse cannot go past this point. So it won't be able to respond. It cannot move. The muscles, the glands would not be stimulated to respond. Okay, so let's try some questions. So back into your book, if you can go to question 2 on page 11. This is 6 marks. So I'm going to give you about 5, 6 minutes to quickly answer this one. I'll give you another minute or so to answer this one, and then we will discuss it. Okay, so let's look at this one. So 2.1, diagram 1 below represents part of a reflex arc, and diagram 2 represents a neuron. So again, before I even start looking at the questions, I like to orientate myself. So if I look at diagram 1, it's telling me it is part of a reflex arc. But now what is important is they are leaving out a few things here. So it's important that you figure out what all the different parts are. So we don't know what is the sensory neuron, what's the motor neuron yet, because they're not showing the pathway of impulses. But now you have to apply your knowledge. I can see this structure over here is an effector, which means it's a muscle. So I know that that is my ending point of a reflex arc. So the impulses are going to come and end over there. So in other words, my impulses is going to go in this way. It's going to go down and then it's going to come out the spinal cord and go to the effector. So that's what I could tell with this one. So if I had to label, A would be the neuron that is going into the spinal cord from the receptor. So that would be your sensory neuron. B is the neuron sitting inside of your spinal cord, which would be your interneuron or connector neuron. And C then would be your motor neuron going away to your effector. And D, it's the gap between two neurons, so that would be synapse. Okay, so that's what I figured out from this diagram over here. Then if we look at diagram 2, so they're saying it represents a neuron. They haven't said what type of neuron it is, but what I can see is that we've got a cell body sitting over here with one outgrowth, and they're showing the flow of impulses. So that's what I can see over there. All right, and then if, well, because it's a flow, that means the impulses will go this way, so towards the cell body and then away from the cell body. And the structure that takes it away is the axon. And then E is that layer surrounding the axon, which would be the myelin sheath. Okay, so let's answer the questions. So if we look at this, 2.1.1 says identify layer E. So like I said, it's surrounding the axon. The axon is the one running through the middle, and the layers surrounding it would be myelin sheath. Then they want structure F. So structure F, because they're showing the flow of impulses, we can see it's going away from the cell body. And I think A for away. So structure F is going to be the axon. Then 2.1.2 says which neuron, A, B, or C, so we're looking at this one, represents the type of neuron shown in diagram 2. So diagram 2, you would need to identify what type of neuron it is. So we know this is a sensory neuron. How do you know that? Well, because there's a cell body with one outgrowth of it. So that's why I know it's a sensory neuron. But they want to know which neuron, A, B, or C, represents the sensory neuron, which is diagram 2. And remember, that's the neuron taking impulses from the receptor towards the spinal cord. So your answer for that one would be A. So which neuron is the sensory neuron, which we identified from diagram 2? That would be A. Then it says which neuron, A, B, or C, is damaged when a person can feel the stimulus but can't respond to it. So the person can feel the stimulus but can't respond. That would mean if I go back, just want to show you this picture because it's a bit more clearer and bigger. If the person can feel the stimulus, it can feel that the impulse is going, it's going to the spinal cord and it's detecting it and interpreting it. But the question was it can't respond, so it cannot move the finger. So that would mean your motor neuron is damaged. So if we look here, they want to know which neuron A, B, or C is damaged when a person can feel but can't respond. So in this situation, in this answer, the answer is C. Just going to pull your answers up so you can see as well. And then 2.1.3 says give the letter and name. So it's again a letter and name. So it's for 2 marks of the part that ensures one directional flow of the impulse. So what helps the impulse continue on its pathway and go from one to another to another? And that is the function of the synapse. So they like to ask either what is the function of the synapse, and that's to ensure one directional flow of the impulse. You don't want the impulse to go in the opposite direction because it's not going to then end on the correct effect or even be interpreted. So the synapse allows it to go from the sensory neuron to the connector neuron to the motor neuron. They wanted the letter, so the letter is D, and the name is synapse because that's the gap between them. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a few more seconds to just take down any answers that you didn't take. All right, so when it comes to neurons, like I said to you, it is important that you fully know this reflex arc and how a reflex action is brought about. But it is just as important to know the different types of neurons, how to draw it, because that's popping up more and more with labels. Remember, when you draw anything in life sciences, you always need a heading and you need labels. So it is important that you go through those 3 types of neurons and their structure type and new. We have covered the nervous system in quite a bit of detail. We've looked at the brain, we've looked at the spinal cord, we've looked at the peripheral nervous system as well, and we've looked at our neurons and our reflex arc. Tomorrow we'll continue working in our booklets, and then we'll go to the eye and the ear. Please make sure you have your booklets with you. Thank you very much for joining today's session. and we will see you tomorrow at 8 o'clock for the second session. If you have any final questions, you can pop it in the chat and I can have a look at it now. But thank you once again and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.